This is a really great pleasure for me to be here. Good evening, everyone, and I appreciate all of you being here, and it's really my greatest pleasure to welcome you in my new role as the director of the Armenian Studies program. As you will see in the course of this evening, I have giant shoes to fill, and it's a bit daunting, but I will do my best over the next 3 years. But we are here gathered on this occasion today, and of course also tomorrow, to honor a very specific person, and to honor in particular and celebrate really the legacy of one of our long-standing patrons, Louise Manoogian Simone. And Ms. Manoogian Simone, as you know, passed away on February 18 of this year, and I would like hereby publicly express my and that of the program's affiliates, as well as the staff's condolences to her family and friends. There's no doubt that Mrs. Manoogian's death is a great loss to the Armenian community, both in Armenia and in its diaspora. I, of course, have never had the opportunity to meet her personally, but I've heard and seen her described as outspoken, witty, exemplary, and there are many more adjectives that would describe her. But most of all, she has been lauded as devoted and as working with an unmatched passion for all things Armenian. And if this would work, we would see her. So Ms. Manoogian Simone was a true Michigander. She was born in Detroit into a family wherein philanthropy was really writ large. Her father, Alex, was born in Smyrna in 1901, and he left Turkey, like many of his compatriots, after the Armenian genocide in 1920. And he arrived at the eastern shores of the US, but it didn't take him very much longer to actually move west and settle in Detroit in 1924. Mr. Manoogian worked to become one of America's leading industrialists and founded Masco Corporation in 1929. A successful businessman, he contributed generously to charitable organizations and educational institutions and supported Armenian educational, social, and cultural projects in particular. In the 1960s, he founded the AGBU Alex and Marie Manoogian Cultural Fund, thereby institutionalizing really the family's dedication to philanthropy. It was in this kind of context that both Louise and her brother Richard grew up. And so it comes really to no surprise that the Manoogian siblings continued the important work of their father through the Alex and Marie Manoogian Foundation. If we think of the legacy of Louise in particular, she is clearly a woman of action. After a massive earthquake devastated some parts of Armenia in 1988, Louise was one of the first to board a US cargo plane delivering food, supplies, and organizing rescue teams to support the disaster area on behalf of the AGBU. But it is clear from her biography that the education of and about Armenians was a priority. She was elected the international president of the AGBU in 1989, and as such not only oversaw the organization's operations all around the globe, but also made a really distinct effort to assure that Armenians would have educational opportunities. And as the president of the AGBU, she worked with UCLA and the Armenian government to set up the American University of Armenia in Yerevan in 1991. In a letter addressed to the AGBU members, she wrote, "If I personally ever wondered whether the challenges, risks, sleepless nights, worrying about how we are going to raise these millions, it was worth it. I quickly forgot my sleepless nights after a recent trip to Yerevan. The students' enthusiasm and interest in the university is simply overwhelming," she writes. "First, it has given them tremendous encouragement. They know they have a unique opportunity in attending the only existing independent American educational institution in all of the Soviet Union, or what was the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. Second," she writes, "it has given hope. They know that they know that a new set of opportunities are available to them, opportunities to compete on a global level and to be equal. The often problematic and paternalistic politics of philanthropy set aside, the educational and economic opportunities made possible through her work, no doubt, have made a significant positive impact on Armenian society. But she did not solely focus on Armenia. She also made sure that educational projects benefiting Armenians and the study of Armenian culture, language, history, politics would be supported in the diaspora, and in particular in her home state, Michigan. In this current political moment, when we see more than ever a devaluation of the humanities, public funding decreasing, and the doling out of some really important educational and research projects to big capital investment, we no doubt have to keep a critical eye on the influx of such capital into the larger institutional structures of our university. And more importantly, resist, I believe, any encroachment on academic freedom powered by outside politics. This being said, and recognizing that the Armenian Studies program has been privately funded since its founding 4 decades ago, wherein the endowment of 2 chairs and the support of our program by the Manoogian family clearly stands out, our mandate and vision has been clear. Louise and Richard's support was to provide resources for scholars to conduct research that would generate new knowledge, new historical knowledge, and change the way Armenian history and culture is taught. And I think there's really no place like Michigan in the United States where this has been taken more seriously. Even at moments when others might not have been so enthused, and I think Ron can and will testify to this, the Manoogian siblings trusted that the university should be a space for the free exchange of ideas, not bound to nationalist ideologies. And when we as scholars are free to do so, dialogue takes place, critique flourishes, and community is forged across differences in field, ethnicity, and national belonging. And I think that the room tonight is a great testament to that particular legacy. Before we hear, and this is why we are here, we're going to hear a lot more about the program and its history from former directors, as well as the successes and challenges of our program. I would like to just give you an idea of what the patronage of the Manoogian family, as well as that of many of others really important supporters, some of whom are in the room, allowed us to do. Naira Tumanian, our program specialist, who has been with us for many years now, and without whom we could not be here today, and nothing else would ever happen. So thank you, Naira, for all that you do. And on top of organizing a conference and many other things, she has put together some numbers for us. So in the course of 4 decades of Armenian studies, we've had exactly, I have to put on my glasses now, 27 postdoctoral fellows, 5 predoctoral fellows, and 10 visiting fellows. And the ones that you see here, some of them are actually in the room, so you can say hi. We've invited them back because they are really at the forefront of what Armenian studies looks like now and will look like in the future. Besides that, we have had exactly 160 events over the course of these years. Of them, we had, 101 lectures, 23 workshops. Those are a lot of work and a lot of fun. 19 conferences and symposia and colloquia, 7 exhibits and performances, and 12 film screenings. And this is a really amazing number, I think. Since 2002, we don't have data actually dating all the way back to the beginning of the Armenian Studies program. But we have data that dates from the 2000s, basically. And so since 2002, Naira is telling me that we awarded 99 fellowships and grants. So this is for students who travel to Armenia. This is for students who are here doing research. And we've sponsored a great number of really, really fantastic individuals. And the number, the financial number, I won't disclose, but it is significant. Teaching. We are, of course, built on the foundation of 2 chairs, one in modern Armenian history and one in the Armenian language and literature. And they've been now around for 4 decades. And within that, we promote, of course, as I already said, the study of history, language, and culture. And our current faculty, I think this is also quite a large number for us. We have 6 faculty that are involved in our program and teach various courses across campus. So we have Hakem Al-Rustum, the Alex Manoogian Professor of Modern Armenia, teaches in history. Kathryn Babayan, whom you'll hear from in a minute, in Near East Studies. Kevork Bardakjian, whom you all know, teaches literature and Armenian culture, also in Near Eastern Studies. Michael Pfeiffer has joined us to be a lecturer of Armenian language and literature and is doing a fantastic job with students. We just had our student meeting, and he's forging some wonderful connections with the young people on campus. Ronald Suny, who you also all know, has been at the university for a very long time, teaches also in the history department, and then I myself teach in international studies as well as in the history department. But here's the great number. Since 2011, so this is not so very much in terms of time, so it's not the entire span of the Armenian Studies program, we were able to teach 3,411 undergraduate and graduate students in all of our courses combined. So that is a significant number. Since 2008, we have 13 graduate students, and currently we have 6 enrolled. There are some, and you will see them also here in the room and tomorrow. And here we come to our former directors. The Armenian Studies program, of course, has benefited from the enthusiastic leadership of these former directors. The program has a long tradition of being intellectually forward-looking, and its leadership has proven to be innovative, really, at every turn. And we are so fortunate to have all 4 of them with us tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing their reflections on 4 decades of Armenian studies at the University of Michigan. And I will invite you all to come up and join me here, and then I will introduce you individually.
I like to be on the extreme left.
Oh, yes. And I guess I don't like to be on the extreme right.
And there you are.
And I'm not as interested.
It is really an honor to do this. So we'll begin with my predecessor and my very good friend, Professor Kathryn Babayan, who is an associate professor of Iranian history. She has led the program for the last 7 years and stands out to me as a fabulous mentor, not only to our graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, but also to me as I take on this directorship. There's many text messages that are going her way all the time. Professor Babayan's expertise lies in the medieval and early modern Persian world, and she focuses on cultural, social, and political histories of Iran, Iraq, Anatolia, and parts of Central Asia. The Persian-speaking regions in which Islam was diversely translated, she writes, in the processes of conversion. Her book, Mystics, Monarchs, and Messiahs, Cultural Landscapes of Early Modern Iraq, focuses on idealists and visionaries who believe that justice could reign in our world. And if you've met her, you know that there is no better fitting topic for her to be writing about. She's currently working on a book titled The City as Anthology, which is the first to really examine literacy in 17th century Isfahan, the capital of the Safavid dynasty. For us here at the Armenian Studies program, her innovative and interdisciplinary thinking and scholarship has had a great impact on the direction of the Armenian Studies program's intellectual endeavor. For example, under her leadership, the program seeded the ideas and generated the support for 2 edited volumes, The Ottoman East in the 19th Century, Societies, Identity and Politics, edited by graduates of our program, Zovinar Dederian and Ali Sipahi, and former Manoogian postdoctoral fellow Yasa Tolga Kora. So really mentoring our students to bring forth these great works. As well as an Armenian Mediterranean, Words, World in Motion, a Mediterranean Perspective, edited by Michael Bedrosian Pfeiffer, to a graduate of our program, and of course edited by him and Kathryn herself. A 3rd edited volume on materiality and Armenian studies is in preparation. So I have my work cut out for myself, and Kathryn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melanie. Most becoming shoes to be filled by. So thank you, Melanie. Thank you for organizing this entire 2-day conference. And it's just a wonderful feeling to look out and see all of these different times where I have encountered all of you squished here in this room. So I'm really looking forward to spending more time with you in a different kind of a configuration tomorrow as well. I did not have the pleasure of meeting Louise Manoogian Simone, but I didn't have to meet her to know that she was a character with a keen sense of duty and vision. And in characteristic fashion of how we do history, you've heard from Melanie too, what she's picked up from the kinds of archival sources that are out there about Louise Manoogian Simone. And in characteristic fashion, I'm lucky that I picked up a different set of past images to create or to recreate some bits of her life. The firstborn daughter of Alex and Marie Manoogian, at the age of 29, her parents established the Louise Manoogian Foundation in her name, awarding her the financial backbone to implement her goal as a philanthropist and humanist, both in Armenia and in diaspora. Following in her father's footsteps, she served on, as we have heard, the board of the Armenian General Benevolent Union, the AGBU, the world's largest nonprofit organization devoted to upholding the Armenian heritage through educational, cultural, and humanitarian programs globally. The very first woman elected to the Eastern Diocesan Council in 1979, she was a trailblazer, playing an important part in the history of the St. Nerses Seminary in North Castle, New York. She fundraised on its behalf, laying the foundations for a significant expansion of its academic role and outreach to students. When Armenia gained its independence in 1991, Louise Manoogian Simone used funds from the AGBU as well as her own resources to help rebuild schools and churches. She was a charter board member and benefactor of the American University of Armenia in Yerevan, an overlap important to note, as president of the university really for a period of 13 years. And until her passing, she continued to donate to Armenia through her renamed Manoogian Simone Foundation, working to reconstruct and maintain schools, hospitals, cultural centers, and historical monuments. I could go on about Louise Manoogian Simone's many endeavors in building Armenian religious and educational institutions on a global scale. But I would like to do in this time remaining is to talk about what she has helped build for us at the Armenian Studies program at the University of Michigan. You have heard from Melanie Talilian about Louise's financial gifting to ASP project through statistics, in a way, amounts she has invested in us. What has emerged from this gifting is a rich community of friends and intellectuals, some of whom are here with us tonight. A vibrant community filled with creative minds that have made Armenian history, literature, and anthropology relevant within the US Academy. This is a legacy of Louise Manoogian Simone we are celebrating tonight and tomorrow. Here at the University of Michigan, Louise Manoogian Simone built on the foundations laid down by her parents, who established the two chairs in Armenian history and literature. You will hear from them tonight. We too have benefited from building on each other's work as directors and chairs. Together with her parents, Alex and Marie Manoogian, and her brother, who survives Sir Richard, they have rescued Armenian studies from the erasures that the catastrophe of the Armenian genocide propelled. Who would have remembered the Armenians if it were not for donors like the Manoogian family? Of course, singular scholars would have written about Armenian history and literature, but I am referring to the institutional force that the patronage of the Manoogian family has allowed us to draw on to help create a field of study that is enriched annually with new graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and visiting fellows. The design of our program of Armenian Studies is unparalleled in the US. I hope there are more that will be established. And it is thanks to the vision of our former director, Gerard Libaridian, that such a multifaceted template was created. Every year, we are able to enrich and enlarge our community and invite two cutting-edge postdocs who have just defended their dissertation. They set the new directions for the field and bring renewable energy into our vibrant intellectual community of Armenian studies, organizing thematic workshops that you've heard of, participating in conferences like that of tomorrow, and exhibits, etc. In funding our ASP program, Louise Manoogian Simone's vision and mandate was to produce a new generation of scholars. Many years ago, she told the first two chairholders in our program, Ronald Suny and Kevork Bardakjian, that they were not getting any younger and needed to think about the next generation of scholars in Armenian studies. Thanks to the Manoogian funding, ASP has been able to take on this challenge, and I think we have accomplished that goal. We are proud to have helped place our graduate students and postdocs in the most prominent international academic positions. Some visions, however, benefit from being well placed. Sometimes it is accidental, or some may say it's resmat or fate. Whatever you may believe, the University of Michigan, I think, is the ideal academic location for Armenian studies to explore the histories and literatures of contact, of circulation, of exchange, with a multitude of analytical possibilities of reading, whether comparative, revisionist, materialist, or interdisciplinary. In other words, the culture at the University of Michigan incites collaboration across disciplines, because that is what we do as members of the institution. Interdisciplinarity is organic here. It's not a rhetorical manner of speech or style. Such an environment is nurturing. It stimulates the kind of work that makes Armenian studies not just a different case study, but a field of study that the Academy will have to engage with. Over the last decade, we have fostered a critical dialogue with emerging scholars around the globe. But every year in April, one or two of our graduate students, along with a faculty mentor, organize a thematic workshop where we invite graduate students from Armenia to engage in our efforts to push scholarship in Armenian studies in new directions and guide them in this process. Our interventions in the study of Armenian history, literature, translation studies, visual arts can be gauged by a carefully curated set of initiatives we have undertaken that will have, inshallah, a long-term impact on the field. Some thematic interventions and the attendant intellectual vision that has shaped our annual International Graduate Student Workshop programmings are Zovinar, who started us off with Connected Histories and the Ottoman East, out of which this edited volume emerged, translation studies with Tamar Bardakjian, gender and sexuality studies, theories of Armenian childhood with Tuche sitting here too, and more recently last year, Armenian Studies and Material Objects, the third volume that is emerging. I hear also that our next 2019 annual workshop will be headed by Manu Sakoyan, who's here on sexualities and psychology in particular, so I'm really looking forward to that. Louise Manoogian Simone's investment in the future of Armenian studies at to foster young talent in the field has paid off. You will hear and judge for yourselves tomorrow. Beyond her financial and our intellectual support of graduate and postdoctoral students, together we have created the best of gifts, a community of friends who help and guide each other, who enjoy each other's company as we share ideas and celebrate life together. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. That was wonderful, and I can only express my consent with the idea of community, that when I first came to the University of Michigan in 2012, the Armenian Studies program embraced me with open arms and has ever since given me an intellectual home, and I could not be more grateful for that. So I will introduce our next speaker, who really doesn't need an introduction because probably everyone in the room knows. Gerard Libaridian was the director of the program from 2007 to 2012, and he had come to the University of Michigan in 1997. Is that correct? 2001. So there is a mistake in the historical sources somewhere, because I have researched this. Don't trust a historian. So in 2001, and he became the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History. He has written on the challenge of statehood, Armenia, political thinking since independence, and has authored Modern Armenia, People, Nation, State, as well as edited a number of books. The topics range from the Armenian genocide to politics surrounding Karabakh, and as well as democracy and statehood. Professor Libaridian's engagement, as many of you know, is not limited, of course, to the academy. He has served in a number of official government positions in the Republic of Armenia, including as the first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. We are incredibly grateful that he took the time to fly in from Boston to be part of this really important evening, and it's my pleasure to have you come up to the podium.
Thank you, Melanie. I think you and all the directors and everyone here have to write a letter to my grandson, who did not have breakfast with me this morning, didn't do reading last night, and he was crying, you know, and asking for dede. And so that's about my grandson. Otherwise, I'll start crying. I'm going to address 4 points. First on Louise, the second on working with Louise, and third on Louise and Armenia, and the fourth Louise and our program here at the university. Louise Simone was one of the toughest people I've ever met. I've known her, I knew her since 1980s. She had very strong views. There was more thinking behind her views than she let you know. She was kind of abrupt, dismissive. So you think it's off-the-cuff remarks, but you better know what you're talking about if you object. You better have thought about it as much as she has. She listened carefully if you had something to say. And not being a scholar or an academic, she had high respect for scholarship and academic integrity and freedom of speech, for analysis. She appreciated analysis. We've had a transformation of the donor class. In the 1960s, 70s, there were donors. You wanted to do a project, you developed the project, and you went to a donor who liked it or didn't like it and gave the money or didn't give the money. Now donors are managers themselves of their projects. They come up with the projects. They supervise the projects. And Louise was a transitional figure. She didn't devise the projects, but she knew what to expect. And she told you what she expected. Working with Louise was not very easy, but I've done 3 periods of work with her. One was in the 1980s when she supported the Zorian Institute, of which I was director. And in fact, she destroyed my first vacation in 20 years. When I asked for some money for the institute, she said, "Give me your budget." So a guy gave her my budget. He said, "Is this a budget? This is not a budget. You go back and do it in the following way." So sitting on a beach in Spain, I spent 2 weeks redoing a budget, which in fact turned out to be much better than what I had done. Then in 91, early 91, still the Soviet Union, when I was invited to establish a new Department of Research and Analysis for the new Parliament of Armenia, I needed computers. I had hired 14 people, one phone call to Louise, and she sent 14 computers, which were the first to come to Armenia, laptop computers. That made a huge difference in terms of the speed with which we could produce things for reports for the presidency of the parliament and then the president. Then came the work with the Armenian Studies program, which was started by Ron and then Kevork and continued. Louise's work in Armenia is fantastic. Some people know some of the stuff. Edmond would know everything on everything that they did, right? Edmond is the national treasure. You know, he's the collective memory of the Armenian people the last 60, 70 years. And he was an advisor to Alex Manoogian and now Richard Manoogian and Louise. And I can tell you that being born in Beirut, when I was 8 or 10, I saw Edmond Azadian as the vice assistant editor of the Ramgavar paper, which was housed next to our building. I remember him from there. So he is a national treasure. Now, other than the computers that she sent to our department in Armenia, the AUA, which was mentioned, the American University of Armenia, which really was her brainchild and her contribution that was, I think she started with $1 million a year, which wasn't something easy to do. She did housing in Karabakh, many people don't know about. And spiritually uplifting, she subsidized the Armenian Symphony Orchestra in Yerevan when there was no light, no electricity, no heating, and the orchestra played under Loris Chiknavorian, and people came with everything they had because they needed that spiritual nourishment that music gave. And she made that possible when nothing else was working in the cultural sphere. There are many other projects she did, and there's one regarding which it's too early to talk in detail, but she was critical at a time of the critical time in the war effort. And people don't know about that. Louise followed the Armenian Studies program here, the chairs, and so did Alex Manoogian, and of course Edmund Azadian, and Jean Gargaro. Every year, every donation, we had to send reports. They questioned us. They wanted numbers on every course, on every student, and then they thought about it. But they didn't interfere. They didn't interfere in our courses, in the way we did things. Louise particularly was interested in more than just making Armenian culture and history known. She wanted that to be part of our culture, knowing our history. And she did think that it was important to know history for political reasons. She was very concerned about generational succession, as Kathryn, I think, mentioned, or was it Melanie or Kathryn? Yeah. She was very interested, and the last time I discussed her, before she gave her first big 1.2 million donation, she said, who's coming after you guys? And I said, who's we guys? Ron, Kevork, you. And I said, I'm much younger than them. Don't put me in the same category. You know, I intend to be around for some time, and I know that my colleagues do. So, but then said generation, and I said, well, you need to help us do that. And she said, well, I expect that to happen, and I'll support it, and then you report to us what you're doing, how you're doing it, and that's what we did. But I also told her, look, the way we do things at the University of Michigan is not just repeat things. We teach our students to be better than we are, to do better than we are, to write differently than we are, than we did, to complete the whole scene. And that's how the University of Michigan transitioned. She said, that's fine. That's fine. We have to change. We need to change. We should be ready to change. Armenian Studies has had an evolution, particularly in this country. And I say in this country not because we are here, but because there's a phenomenon that is quite unique to this country. This focus on chairs, centers, programs. You don't find it elsewhere. Particularly programs. You don't find it in Armenia. Universities do not have public programming, extracurricular programming in Armenia. And a lot of other universities have chairs but do not have the programs. They have programming, but to have a program that is full, and it is Louise's help and the Manoogians that made it possible to have a more complete, comprehensive way to deal with the preparation of a generation that not only is the next generation and are connected to us, the instructors, the teachers, but also they know each other, they help each other, they inspire each other, and that is a very, very important thing. The Armenian Studies here started as amateur historians, linguists who started writing things because they wanted to change the image of the starving Armenian. To say, we had kings once. We had Gatoligoses once. We are not just the poor people you see now. We once were big. That was the initial phase. Then there was the professionalization of history in the 60s, basically, beginning in the 60s with Louise Nalbandian and Richard Ovanesian. And that also brought the modern period into play. Before that, it was largely the modern period was not legitimate. You studied ancient world, the medieval world, but not the modern period. And we went into the modern, but also we added the contemporary, which is as important. Subsequently, for example, if you take the study of genocide, at first it was extremely descriptive, right? This is what happened to us. Pity us. The Turks are bad. We were good. We were victims. And then came the question as to why did it happen? And we're still arguing about that. But I've also proposed the idea that we need to ask a third question. How was it possible that it happened? So we continue, generation after generation, we continue adding questions. I really appreciated the comment on the University of Michigan being the right fit for this program, because the university itself was open, and we've had tremendous support, I know from in the past and the present, from administrations, from departments, department heads, chairmen, chairwomen, International Institute. So this is a collective measure. I remember when Kevork was the director and Ron had come back from Chicago, and I was here already, but when Ron came, Dean Terry McDonald called the three of us in, if you remember. And he said, what are you guys going to do? And we three of us looking, what do you mean? We're going to teach. He said, is there any other place where there are 3 professors of Armenian in this world, in this country? No. So think about something, and I'll support you. And I'm sorry he isn't here, but he was tremendously involved in pushing us, and also talking to Louise, talking to Richard, and of course Edmund and Gargaro and Eugene Gargaro. And this is a very, very special place for me. I don't travel much anymore, but I couldn't say no to this one. Thank you for inviting me. Still, you have to write to my grandson. You know, yeah, that's you can. So I have been honored to contribute, to be part of this process. I'm honored to have had such colleagues. And Kevork, I think I have the shortest tenure, right? 5 years. Ron had oh boy. Kevork is the longest. Kevork is 5, 7, 12 years. 7 years for Kathryn, and no, 7 years for Kathryn. I was here 5, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I enjoyed the students, and I'm still at it, even though officially retired. I've told my grandson already what I tell my students. My first job is to confuse you. And then we see what happens with there. Thank you very much for everything, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Gerard. You started hinting at certain stories that I think we will ask lots of questions later on. Some very interesting, of course, things that we don't know about your relationship with Louise and the Manoogians over the years. Now we have the chance to hear from Dr. Kevork Bardakjian, who in 1987 became the first holder of the newly established Marie Manoogian Chair of Armenian Language and Literature. And from 1995 to 2007, he was the director of the Armenian Studies program. Professor Bardakjian has been active in the Society of Armenian Studies. He has served on the editorial board of Armenian Studies journals and has published the historical figures and events in some of Gerard Libaridian's allegorical work, also a reference guide to modern Armenian literature, I think, which is a classic, and whoever in the room has ever learned or attempted to learn the Western Armenian language would have encountered this textbook of modern Western Armenia. Kevork, if I may invite you up to the podium, please.
Thank you Melanie. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. Much of what I was going to say has been said already, especially about Louise. Gerard included it. But I would like to begin by expressing my thanks to the Manoogian family in general, for reasons that you just heard, that my chair was established by them, and Ron's, of course, Alex and Marie Manoogians, and their son, Richard, and daughter, Louise, for whom we are here to pay tribute to her outstanding support for our program, whether moral or monetary terms. My move here, I'll start with this story, was Ron's idea. He had this idea of about critical mass. He was toiling alone here, and he, when we we met at Princeton, I think, and he started luring me, and I showed an interest, and of course there were some visionaries like Edmund Azadian here and others, Ben Stolz, and who worked for establishing a second chair with Ron, they told, which eventually happened. And what attracted me really here was the idea that that was the fascinating challenge of building up a program. Ron can charm you. He says, come and we'll build a program. Just think about this, so important, so exciting. So we worked together under his leadership until his migration to Chicago in 1994. I left Harvard and came with these hopes and expectations, and I was not disappointed. Ron's period was, he'll talk about it, of course. We accomplished many good initiatives, conferences, proposals, symposia, lectures, film festivals, the Armenian Odyssey, musical events, many initiatives. We worked at the time with and reported once a year to an advisory council, which was in place when I came here and vanished after the end of my term as director in 2007, by the time. There was no executive council, and we were assisted by the indefatigable Mauricio Ostefan of Greece. Ron was and remained until his departure for Chicago, director of the program. An illegal body, as he once put it more recently, which had emerged as an established entity with its legal, again, quote unquote, formal roots of origin lost to all memory, whether institutional or individual. It was not established by a decree. The university had no formal date, but as Ron explained it once, he called it a program, he worked for it, and it became a program. My purpose tonight, though, is the second phase in this history of ASP, the 14-year terms of my directorship, which I would call a formative period with some of the essential distinctive elements of the ASP taking shape during Ron's directorship. That is, some distinctive trends emerged while Ron was running the show. In the summer of 1987, the first of these, a small group of Michigan students and faculty visited Armenia on a 2-week tour led by KBB. And by the summer of the following year, it had been transformed into the Armenian Summer Language Institute, an intensive 8-week program in Yerevan with KBB as its founder, director, and principal instructor. It enjoyed a wide reputation, attracting students not only from the US and Canada, but also from South America, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, Czechia, Italy, Japan, and Egypt. as my boss Ronald Suny commented at the time, the Institute put the ASP on the map. As it flourished, Mr. Manoogian kindly agreed to my request for a language lab with 24 carols and allocated $100,000 for the purpose. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the program was suspended for the following 4 dark years, and Louise asked me to consider moving it to the AUA, where there were better maintenance conditions. The dorm where the students lived had become uninhabitable, and but with a generous subvention from the Cultural Association of Armenians from Istanbul, I was able to renovate the 4th floor. Louise was very skeptical, but she was very impressed by when she saw what was done, the 4th floor, where my summer students lodged. She had the entire building renovated. And just to give you an idea about some of the students who graduated from that summer school was Sergio Laporta, Maud Mandel, Bert Vaux, Stephanie Platz, Rachel Goshkarian, Nicole Vartanian, and many, many others. I don't remember the names. This was the first. Second major accomplishment was the expansion of the Armenian holdings. I attached great importance for Armenian books. You cannot have a good program without a good collection for the working collection, at least for the faculty and students. When I first arrived here, the Armenian collection numbered 1,500 volumes. Working with the Slavic and Middle Eastern librarians, we managed to build up an excellent working collection. By the turn of the century, that is by the year 2000, with 18,000 volumes, we became one of the 4 major Armenian collections, the Library of Congress, Harvard, and UCLA. The collection grew with gifts such as Haruchun Berberian's private collection, by exchange programs with the Armenian National Library and the Fundamental Library of the Armenian National Academy of Sciences, and by the acquisition of private collections such as those of Gersam Aharonian, Vahe Vahyan, and the greatest of them all, the gem, the Abadjian collection from Istanbul, numbering close to 4,500 volumes, comprising 1,200 Ottoman, Turkish, and about 3,000 Armenian books. Many of the Armenian volumes are only available at Michigan. The acquisition was really a great accomplishment. I remember Edmund managed to get $50,000 from the state, which was not to be done, used for these purposes. But the credit at this point went to the library, which sent me to inspect the collection in Istanbul, and we bargained. The initial price was $125,000. We bargained it down to $80,000 payable over 4 years. And it is really a very, very good collection. As I said, some of the books is available only in that collection in this country. And there was the third initiative. In the early 90s was the idea of convening an annual conference for graduate students in Armenian studies. This has been mentioned. For a number of reasons, it did not materialize in 91, 92. Dormant for years, the idea was revived when UCLA, some 10 years later, organized its own. When I approached them to organize it jointly, they said they wanted to go it alone. Peter Cowie said their students were gung-ho about it. As is known, the initial concept of the colloquium came into fruition under Girard's scholarship, directorship 10 years ago. To return to the ASP, I was appointed its director in 1995. And I called this a formative period. And ASP administrative structure was put in place then. The director would be appointed by the director of the II to a term of 3 years with a stipend which Ron did not receive, and research funds. They would be answerable to the II director. The II would subsidize a half-time administrative position. I sometimes had 30% or 40% position, but never more than 50. And the steering committee, nominated by the II, was to help the director with the program. We had, some money, but no major resources. And as before, in Ron's days, we requested Manoogian funding on an annual basis. Ron would prepare a budget and send it over to Mr. Manoogian, and we'll get the money. Then our great benefactor, Mr. Manoogian, passed away in 1996, and soon Louise took matters into her own hands. And a long period of close relationship began with generous support from her, whether from her parents' fund or her own or the AGBU funds. Since I have little time, I won't be able to describe in any detail the following decade of my term and will outline the remaining issues sort of thematically. I continued as director director of the ASP and the Summer Institute, worked with our graduate students, worked with the Armenian Students of Cultural Association, the library administration, both to expand the collection and find funds and catalogers, at the same time as I taught and conducted research, and attended to two urgent matters: finding a successor to Ron and major funding for our students and activities. With support from Martha Lackham and the Development Office, we embarked on an arduous route. First, the Lex Manoogian endowment had to be augmented. And in early February 1997, Louise and Richard Manoogian offered $500,000 for the Alex Manoogian Chair, following which both endowments stood at $1 million each. Over time, we managed to establish more modest funds. In January 1996, Dean Ara Paul kindly agreed to convert the Harry Ardash's Paul Book Fund into a general memorial fund for all purposes. This was followed by Berj Haidostian Memorial Lecture Fund, then the Richard Yarmain Fellowship Fund, and then the Arsene Sanjan Fellowship Fund. We also organized general fundraising, and our graduate students were fortunate enough to receive most generous fellowships from the DZL, the Dolores Zora Liebman Fund, where apparently Armenian Council did not go unheard. While presenting an intense and extensive series of lectures, symposia, and conferences, a few jointly with other universities, invited speakers from many universities, many, we relentlessly pursued the filling of the vacant chair of history. We invited scholars for short-term teaching. Stefan Asturian taught in winter of '96. In the fall of same year, we invited 4 scholars to teach 2-week-long mini courses. The idea was to take a close look at them. Finally, in 1997, Dr. Stephanie Platz was appointed as assistant professor of Armenian history, but she resigned in 2000. Since the mid-1990s, I had been in contact with Gerard to teach at Michigan, and when Dr. Platz resigned, I approached him again, and Gerard was invited to teach for 1 semester a year for 2 or 3 years, then was given 2 5-year terms as assistant professor visiting. The chair once again became vacant until after Gerard's departure, until Hakem's appointment. Now, I have many memories and working experience with Louise. I worked on various sporadic occasions before 1997. For instance, she would ask me to organize English classes for the Vaskanian Seminary in Sevan. She would ask me to review books she had agreed to subsidize, or would ask for a list of good Armenian literary works to start a translation series. many other things. Or he would call me with questions about my textbook, which her instructor used to teach her Western Armenian. But our association grew substantially as I began to submit annual budgets or requests to subsidize conferences. I would visit her in New York to discuss and finalize budgets and projects. The dean, Terry McDonald, took a very active role in the ASP at that time. This is about the turn of the 21st century. And when we heard that Ron might return, we contemplated fuller budgets and even a center for for Armenian Studies. Throughout, Louise had extended solid support. Eventually, we managed to bring them together in New York, and the project initially for a $20 million endowment was eventually reduced to an annual support of a few $100,000, a very generous, of course, allocation that was principally began to be used when Gerard was taking over. Very shortly thereafter, Gerard was appointed director. Teaching for my students, I was very much interested to afford as good and leadership guidance as possible. From my very first days as being associated with the Society for Armenian Studies, talking with Nina Garsoyan, and until later with Richard Hovannesyan, who had students, graduate students, many, but most of them had switched to other professions. There were no jobs, there were no positions. And that taught me a lesson, and they also agreed that you should encourage our students of Armenian not to do just Armenian, but to expand and to have a larger context to their scholarly work. I also was involved in the SAS, as was mentioned, and the idea was, I always encouraged my students to be part of the SAS, to establish contact with other people in the field. I remember in the 80s we didn't have many. The field was still young. And as in the 70s when I worked with Thompson at Harvard, we looked around, we felt that there was a need for textbooks. We want to teach Armenian, there is no textbook. We want to teach literature, there is no textbook. So he wrote his classical Armenian textbook. I'm not a linguist, but I had to write the Western Armenian textbook, and then the literature, etc. And Robert wrote a classical Armenian. So with all possible means, I also, in the 80s, when I was president of the Society for Armenian Studies, on 2 occasions, based on my observations at Mesa conventions, where our sessions were not attended by our neighboring traditions, those who studied Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, they were not attended. We talked to each other. And I sent us a circular emphasizing the need to do comparative and interdisciplinary work, because that's how we would attract attention to our field. We would bring into our field those who worked on our neighboring traditions, and I don't know how seriously it was taken, but that was an observation based on a reality. I think I could have said much more about the program and other on Louise, and especially I want to emphasize what Gerard said, that she was a very tough lady. I have sat with her father in his cultural committees, where we summed up our reviews about the applications made to Mr. Manoogian for money. Mr. Manoogian never made a decision on the spot. It took him weeks and months maybe to decide who gets what. But when I sat with Louise, she asked questions. She, very tough, very, very good questions. And after making sure that she understood your project very well, on the spot, told you that, yes, you have the money. So a very, very practical, smart, tough lady who stood with us for so long. Thank you. And now I would like to turn to our current newly appointed director, Melanie Tanielian, to wish her good luck with her term as the new director of Armenian Studies program.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevork. It's so interesting to hear these stories, especially for me not having been here for as many years as you guys have been here, and actually getting sort of at the history of the program and familiarizing myself with building of the library and our wonderful collection through Kevork. So our last speaker is Professor Ron Suny, who is currently the William Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History. He was the first holder of the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History. As the chair, he founded and directed the Armenian Studies program from 1981 to 1995, and I'm sure he's going to talk to us about the challenges of that. Since then, and I'm going to skip your escape to Chicago, because you obviously came back because you like us better. And since then, he was the Charles Tilly Collegiate Professor of Social and Political History here from 2005 to 2015, as well as the director of our beloved Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies from 2009 to 2012. He has won way too many awards to list any of them here. Among them, in any age, and he has authored and co-authored a great many books, a list that puts all of us to shame. But the publication of monographs date to the first in 1972, titled The Baku Commune, 1917 to 1918, Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution. And I'm going to end with the most recent, and there's many, and I want to know the exact number at some point. There's many in between, and the most recent, I believe, unless you've published something on the side in the meanwhile, but I think it's The Red Flag Unfurled. Is that the one? Okay, that was from 2017. And of course, in his book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, that has served me well in my own work as well as in my courses. What speaks to his leadership in Armenian studies most poignantly is that in 2005, the Middle East Studies Association, an association that was not so keen on enclosing Armenian studies into its program for many, many years. It has changed since then. But the Middle East Studies Association awarded Ron Suny and his co-organizer, Professor Fatma Mugagocek, who is also here in the audience of the University of Michigan, its Academic Freedom Prize for their work in bringing Armenian Turkish scholars together to further the study of the Armenian genocide. And I think that has dramatically shifted the kind of work that we do and the kind of students that we teach. And I turn it over to Ron. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. You've all been very patient. Thank you for being so patient. I want to thank you all for coming and for waiting so long. This is a great honor for me to be here. I am very proud of what we've achieved, and it was really good hearing about these things. And I'm going to tell you how it all started. It started with a telephone call from someone I didn't know. He was phoning me from the University of Michigan. But I was teaching at a small liberal arts college, Oberlin College. It's in a state which will remain unnamed to the south of us. And on the line was the chairman of the Slavic Literature and Languages Department, Ben Stoltz. And Ben asked me if I'd be interested in coming up to Michigan and teaching a one-semester course in Armenian history. So I was sort of intrigued by this idea and also by the challenge, because I had never taught Armenian history. Now, I had studied it 2 years with Nina Garsoyan at Columbia University. After 4 semesters, we ended roughly in the 14th century because she considered anything after that to be journalism. And I can say that at the time that I was coming up here, there was no modern Armenian history except for the work of some narcissistic and nationalist people who wanted to remember what we had lost or who we were, and Richard Hovhannisyan. That is, Richard Hovhannisyan, who wrote those 4 encyclopedic volumes, was the only one in the field. So I was going to come up here to try to teach a field that I had not been specifically trained in. I was very dubious about my Armenian language. This is a language, by the way, that I had worked hard to acquire, but which has consistently defeated me all the many years. And Ben Stoltz invited me, nevertheless, to come to Ann Arbor to meet with him, which I did, and then he drove me to a very strange place called Taylor, Michigan, to meet Alex Manoogian, and the man who you've already heard about, who I've always thought of as Alex Manoogian's Minister of Culture, Edmund Azadian. And so we went, as we did so many times, Edmund, you'll remember, and Kevork, you'll remember, and Gerard too, I'm sure. We went to some restaurant, rather nondescript restaurant, and we would eat some rather geriatric-like food. You'd kind of gum it. And then we would have a discussion, and Mr. Manoogian would only at the end say, "So, what do you want? What do you need?" And then we would talk about it, and eventually we usually got what we needed. But he was very hesitant about forming a chair or supporting or giving an endowment. But Ben Stoltz and Edmund and one other indomitable figure, Alice Haidosian, who was an alumna of Michigan, were very persistent. And they, after many years, 2 years it took, convinced Mr. Manoogian to give us this money for an endowed chair. This all seemed like a pipe dream. It would have remained so, except for these big 3, Azadian, Haidosian, and Stoltz. So I came to Michigan in 1981 after the first year, 77, 78. And when I came, this is some 42 years ago, and I taught the first course in Armenian history, I was scrambling because the sources weren't there. We didn't have much work really published in the field. I'm not saying I made it up, but it was difficult, and you had to go back to original sources and read all kinds of things. So it was a lot of work. Armina and I, my wife Armina and I, arrived in the fall of '81, and we began our life in Ann Arbor, and we began to study this program. We had a chair, but we did not have an official program. We had a few students, not many at first. Classes would be maybe 5, 10, 15 at the most. We, in fact, had difficulty attracting people to come to our events at the time, though we did a lot of events in Southfield, in the church or near the church, and there you'd have a larger audience. So I decided, rather impulsively, with no one's permission, to invent an Armenian Studies program. I got no official imprimatur to do that. I never asked the university for permission. In those days, we had paper catalogs. And so I simply wrote up a copy and stuck it in the paper catalog as if the program already existed. Now, don't let that get out of this room, because I'm not sure if we have a legitimate program. Apparently, now, once we had that, we had a program, we needed a second chair. We needed someone who would teach language and literature. And that took some effort, but again, thanks to the extraordinary foresight and imagination and determination of the big three and Mr. Manoogian, we established the second chair, the Maria Manoogian Professorship in Armenian Language and Literature, and my colleague Kevork Bardakjian has held that chair ever since. This was a pioneering achievement. 2 chairs at the time in a single institution. Michigan, at the time, had very few, if any, endowed chairs. And the Manoogian chairs were a model for the university to go out and find some ethnic community, Polish, Ukrainian, whatever, and make chairs. And in fact, they've been somewhat successful at that. Our program, however, grew slowly. Eventually, interested students would sign up for the courses. And our key benefactors and supporters, most important, Mr. Manoogian and Edmund and Alice, encouraged us to grow. The program at the beginning was largely an undergraduate program. It was geared at emerging consciousness of and love for things Armenian. But it was not easy to convince Armenian students, kind of heritage students, of the importance of history over mythology. I can remember when I taught one day about the conversion of Armenians, and I mentioned that there was a story that the king of Armenia, Turdat, had been turned into a boar. Is this right, Michael? Right? Turned into a boar, and then Grigor Lusavoric lectured to him, and eventually he converted. I don't know how boars convert. You'll have to clear up the story. And he was turned back into a person. And I said, of course, this is a myth, to which I got all kinds of resistance. What do you mean? That's in the scripture. I mean, the Armenian scripture, Khoronatsi or Agatangeles or wherever, and there was resistance in such things. One time I brought Miguel to come and lecture in the course. A Turk in an Armenian course? Again, there was practically a revolt. So there was a difficulty in those days that I don't think we face that much now. That is trying to establish that there's a real history here to be understood, to be based on information, on real evidence, etc. And amazingly, and I think Edmund, you and Alice and Manoogian should be very proud of this, we did develop a field. We did create, as if you've heard with all my colleagues, a number of scholars. When Mr. Manoogian passed away, the torch then passed, as you've heard, to the remarkable, energetic, and determined daughter, Louise. Kevork and I would meet with her every once in a while. Once I was actually at her wonderful apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York. And she was very impressed by our commitment to the program and to scholarship. And as several people have already said, she told us, you're all getting older and we need to get a younger generation. That's your mandate. And I'll support that. And in fact, that's what we've done. You saw the statistics that Naida put up earlier. Louise made it clear to us in her own unvarnished way that the torch had to be passed. Louise Simone was also one, and this hasn't been mentioned yet, was one of the first supporters of WATS, the Workshop in Armenian Turkish Scholarship, that Miguel, I, Kevork, and later Gerard came together to bring Armenian, Kurdish, we had Kurds at the first meeting, Circassians even, and Armenians, Turks and Armenians and Kurds together to talk about the genocide. When we started that meeting, and the first one, I was already at Chicago by that time, when we started the first meeting in Chicago in the year 2000, there was a lot of resistance in the Armenian community. That is, Vahak Dadrian and Richard Hovhannissian would not come to the first meeting. Why are you talking to Turks? Let them apologize and recognize the genocide, and then we'll have them and we'll have a dialogue with them. And I said, but Babam, this is not the way you do it. First we talk, and then you come, and we'll see what works out. And from that first meeting, and I still remember your wonderful talk there, Gerard, from that very first meeting, we managed to create what later would become a kind of consensus around how one does scholarship on the genocide. And the genocide at that point, in the beginning of the 2000s, did not have a very firm, evidence-based, archivally based historiography yet. And Watts and the ensuing 2 decades were fundamental in establishing that. And you couldn't imagine then that we would have in this program Turkish and Kurdish students that would then, knowing Turkish, knowing Kurdish, knowing Ottoman, knowing Armenian, would be coming and doing this work and establishing the foundation of a whole field of study that has grown enormously. Louise, having given us this mandate, as I think Gerard mentioned, never, like her father, never interfered in what we were doing. Now, they knew we had different politics. I won't mention that some of us are very far to the left, and some are Dashnags originally, though later thrown out of the party. But in fact, we came from all different kinds of places, right? I remember Edmund read my first book, The Baku Commune, before I had been appointed at Michigan. But he wanted to see if this guy was any good. And he said to me, you know, you're more interested in those Bolsheviks than in Armenians. He understood exactly where I was. But over the years, I've become more interested, and I've written about Armenians as well. So they pulled me into the fold. My mother had always said to me, don't get involved with the Armenians, right? They'll pull you right in, you'll never get out. It's absolutely true. If there are any graduate students here, remember that. That's very important. Besides our discussions of funding and how the program was faring, my fondest memory of Louise came on one of the visits to her elegant New York apartment. She had actually read a book of essays that I wrote called Looking Toward Ararat, Armenia in Modern History. And she was generously complimentary. Now, I have to tell you that my work is more scholarly than popular. It's not particularly easy to read if you don't have some serious interest in the subject. And it usually goes against the grain of the sort of prominent, dominant views in the Armenian community itself. And she read this book. I was putting together these essays to provoke thinking, new thinking about Armenian history. And that book, rather sort of hubristically, was thought of by me, a young scholar still, as a challenge to the older, nationalistic and narcissism, uncritically patriotic accounts of the great deeds and triumphs and tragedies of Armenians throughout their long history. And it tried to present a view of the Armenian nation as a product not of God or of nature, but of real people, flawed people often, heroic people at times, acting in history to make a nation. That nation was not ancient and continuous through the centuries, but was largely realized fully as a modern nation only in modern times. And this book stirred up more controversy than I had anticipated. It was attacked in Armenia. There's a book that's written against it. It was attacked many times in the diaspora. But Louise Simone told me how much she had learned from the book and how much she appreciated this new approach. And I was really genuinely surprised and humbled by her response. I don't know what she thought about the book on the genocide, because looking toward, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, which Princeton published, is also a book which has been very critically received and very hostilely often received by Armenians. I remember when I was going to start writing that book, I explained that my goal was to try to write and understand why this thing happened, right? Why it could happen. Not quite the question you put, but why it happened. And a very prominent scholar said to me, Ronald, don't try to explain why there was a genocide. If you try to explain why there was a genocide, you will rationalize it and you'll end up justifying it. If you don't explain why there was a genocide, what are you left with? You're left with, they're Turks. That's what they do. You have a kind of racist or culturalist or religious Muslim versus Christian's argument. So I still, forgot that, and I went on and wrote the book and tried to explain how the leaders of the Young Turks could develop a mentality, what I call an affective disposition, which in fact explains how they could turn against one of the most productive groups within the empire, a group, by the way, that was overwhelmingly loyal to that empire. There were rebels and so forth. There were defectors, but overwhelmingly it was more Krikor Zorab than it was those who ran off to Tiflis who represented the community. And how does one explain that? And that already it was a challenge. I don't know what Louise thought of the book, and I don't know if she ever got to read the book. But I have the feeling that she was still an ally and a friend and someone, if we had had that discussion late in her life, that she would have understood. Over the years, whenever we needed aid, whenever there was a new thing to be done, Louise came through. She'd inquire about the status of the program, the number of students, but always with the thought, how can I help? Without Alex Manoogian, without Louise, without her brother Richard now, there'd be no Armenian Studies program at the University of Michigan and all the things that have grown out of it. Because of their commitments, because of their trust, because of their generosity, we are able to carry out what Alex and Louise propose that we do. Let me end with this. You know, those in this room, because we care about this, that Armenians are a deeply historic people. We are historical people. We are sometimes burdened too much by too much history. We don't sit comfortably with our history, which is filled with dispersion, massacres, tragedies. Scholars, and the work that they do, are often not comprehended, certainly not appreciated, to many outside the academy. We live in a country, the United States, where stupidity is celebrated at the highest possible levels. So the views of people who sit seriously and look at evidence, not alternative facts, but actually what the documents say, people who reject nationalism and partisanship, which we find even in the Armenian community, let alone in the United States, are often considered too heretical and unpatriotic. But at Michigan, as my colleagues have mentioned, we have been extremely fortunate. We've been given the opportunity in this privileged sanctuary of ours to explore the Armenian past and present without interference from politicians and pundits. And thanks to this university, and thanks to our patrons, our program is training the next generation of scholars, true searchers for truth, who, while exploring the past and the present, are really building a better Armenian future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for your talk. So we have a few minutes, perhaps, for questions, if you do have some. Otherwise, we will also probably stick around for a few minutes. And if you want to just come up and engage with this with the panelists, that would be wonderful. We're going to resume our meeting tomorrow morning, and in this very same room. And it will be, I think, a wonderful conversation, and you're all invited to join us to see the work that has been done in the last years, and to listen to the sort of very cutting edge and field-defining work of our postdocs and faculty. So I'll leave it at that and invite you guys to engage with the panels in an individual setting, probably. Yeah? Mm-hmm.